Hi everyone, I'm Vandana Rai here from Immigration Advisors New Zealand, and I'm making this part 2 teaching in New Zealand video for all you overseas qualified teachers. So in my last video I did give a lot of information on how the overseas qualified teachers could apply for a registration and then become a certified teacher in New Zealand and few other details. And I'll try to answer few questions that I've got from all of you with more specific questions pertaining to your teacher's registration and associated issues that could arise, what you should be aware of while you are applying for that registration, and few other questions like that. So I'll begin with just giving a brief on how can overseas qualified teachers get a registration in New Zealand. And before that, what is the need? Why would anybody consider coming to New Zealand and teaching? You may be a qualified teacher, very happy with the profession, with wherever you are teaching, India, Sri Lanka, Dubai, Middle East, UK, South Africa, any one of those countries. So I would still request you to consider coming and teaching in New Zealand as well if you are thinking of relocating. Why? Because teachers are in shortage in New Zealand, and as per Minister of Education's recent information that we've received, they are looking at filling these gaps and these shortages from A, teachers which are returning back to the profession, and B, from overseas qualified teachers. So overseas qualified teachers are regarded highly in New Zealand, and New Zealand really wants to attract those skilled people for New Zealand, and have offered a lot of benefits as well for this. To be very precise, overseas teachers relocation grant is one of them, wherein the overseas trained teachers are given a relocation grant of $5,000 just to make sure that the relocation is as smooth as could be. So, and what exactly would be covered in this relocation grant could be your initial visit for a familiarization visit that you would do to see if this country is good for you. It could include your immigration advisors fees, it could include your visa processing fees, it could include your medicals, your fees for your PCC, all other expenses that you would do as a result of this relocation. And the fact that New Zealand is offering a relocation grant to overseas trained teachers also confirms the need for teachers to be here, the importance New Zealand is giving to overseas qualified teachers. So really, if you are one of those teachers who are qualified overseas, working as teachers overseas, I would again request you to consider New Zealand as one of your options, and sure you won't regret that. Okay, before giving in details on those questions, a brief on how can your overseas qualification be assessed here. So for anyone who's trained overseas, you would be eligible to come and teach in New Zealand if A, you are registered by Teaching Council of New Zealand and you have a current practicing certificate. So how does it work? To begin with, first of all, you must have a qualification that is comparable to a New Zealand teaching qualification before you could even apply for a registration. And what are a few things which overseas qualified teachers should be aware of pertaining to their degrees attained overseas. So a very important thing which I would like all of you to be aware of is whether your qualification is an education qualification or a teaching qualification. Make sure that you get more details on that. Second, how long was your practicum component, because that is really very important. If you're not meeting the mandatory requirement of the length of practicum needed for any overseas qualification to be considered equivalent or comparable to a New Zealand teaching qualification, then you will end up wasting your money applying for NZQA, IQA, and the qualification may not be may not come out as a comparable to a New Zealand qualification. So how does it work? So first step, you've got your overseas qualification assessed by NZQA. Another important factor that you should keep in mind is when you're getting your overseas qualification assessed by applying to NZQA, that's a New Zealand Qualification Authority, and getting an IQA done, just make sure that you apply for all your overseas qualification and not just your education qualification. I'll tell you why. Because what happens, what if this qualification, this education qualification or a teaching qualification that you've held overseas is not a comparable qualification to a New Zealand teaching qualification? Then the next step for you could be getting trained in New Zealand, and if that happens, then you would again need to get all your qualifications assessed. So if you're getting initially, if you're getting your bachelor's, your master's, get everything assessed, because that will make sure that you don't need to get another IQA done if your education or teaching qualification is not comparable to New Zealand qualification in teaching. And second, it's really important for you to get all your qualification assessed, because you would need these again if you get a job in New Zealand and you get your overseas, you will need to get these overseas qualification assessed for a salary enhancement as well. So whatever money you are putting in the IQA will never get wasted. So if your qualification is assessed as comparable to New Zealand teaching qualification, perfect, works for you. If it doesn't, even in that stage, this IQA would not be wasted, because it is one of the mandatory steps before you can move on to consider studying in New Zealand and attain one of those qualifications which lead to registration. So fine, you've got this done. The second requirement for you to get the teacher's registration is to confirm to the teaching council that you do have the English language proficiency that is required to be a teacher. What exactly it is? The teaching council requires you to have a 7 bands in each module IELTS academics or an equivalent English proficiency if you are not from one of those native English speaking countries. So there are a few other exceptions which I would list in below my video, and if you're not meeting those requirements, then yes, you need to confirm your English language proficiency by one of these internationally recognized tests. Very popular is an IELTS academics, wherein you are required 7 bands in each module. Another one really popular would be a Pearson test of English, a PTE, in which you would need score of 65 in all modules. And I like to stress here that the teaching council has made an exemption here last year, and now the scores could be clubbed. So if you've not managed to get the required score in one of these tests, then you can take again and you can club your scores. You can even club an IELTS within PTE and submit as many scores as you want, provided all these tests are dated less than 2 years back when you make this application. However, I would still like to emphasize one thing here. So English is really one of the mandatory requirements, not only because that will make you eligible for a registration, but also it's needed for your role. It's needed for you to teach effectively in New Zealand. So if you're really struggling to get that English requirement, if you're struggling to meet that English requirement, and if you really have to train yourself extensively or tutor yourself extensively to reach that 7 in each module in IELTS or an equivalent score, I would say please reconsider your decision, because then it may not be very easy for you to teach in New Zealand as well. So Teaching Council has made that a mandatory requirement for teachers registration, and there is a reason behind the same, because it's not easy when you've got to deal with students, you've got to deal with parents, and if you're not proficient with the language, you will struggle with that. So you've got the your qualification assessed. It's come out as a qualification which is comparable to a teaching qualification in New Zealand at level 7 or higher. You've got the English language score. The third step would be you need to submit a police clearance certificate from your country of citizenship and all other countries where you've resided for more than 12 months. And then you'll have to apply for a teacher's registration with Teaching Council of New Zealand. And you'll be registered, you'll get a practicing certificate, and then you can probably start applying for a job. So you've done all these while you were still overseas, and then you need to have a job with you before you can think of relocating to New Zealand. Should not be very difficult considering that New Zealand is experiencing teachers shortage. However, New Zealanders don't want to compromise on the quality of teachers. So you really need to think carefully. Are you teaching in one of those countries which is considered as a comparable labor market to New Zealand? Is the teaching learning in your country comparable to the teaching learning in New Zealand? If yes, probably easier for you to get a job. If no, reconsider your decision. Do you really want to go that long way, get a registration done, may or may not come, wait for a job? Because you've been teaching in a different environment, different scenario, it may not be very easy for you to get a job in that case. Probably better to come and get trained in New Zealand and then look for a job. Okay, fine. So you've got this. How can an advisor help you in the entire process? Or do you really need an immigration advisor in that process? Depends on you, but I would say there are various ways in which we can assist you, and probably making your pathway easier, simpler, and in the end probably saving you more time than you realize. I'll give you a few examples. So what if your overseas qualification comes out as level 7 through an IQA, but the NZQA states and the IQA states that it is at level 7. However, it is not comparable to a New Zealand teaching qualification. Then what? Is there no pathway for you? I would say there still are few pathways for you to consider. One could be applying for registration through the discretionary process. What exactly is it? So what happens is, when your qualification is not comparable to New Zealand teaching qualification, then you have an option of applying for registration through discretionary pathway, and then you submit to Teaching Council a lot more information on your qualification, the practicum components that you had in that qualification, your teaching experience, the appraisals that you would have undergone, the professional development programs that you would have undertaken in your teaching career. If you give all these information, then the Teaching Council can consider whether you could be considered as a trained teacher for New Zealand, and if it is a yes, you could still be granted a teacher's registration to teach in New Zealand. So you are a registered teacher, but what happens is you could be a registered teacher, but you would not be called a qualified teacher, and there is a difference between the two. So when you are not a qualified teacher, but you do have a registration through the discretionary pathway, you can teach in New Zealand, but the school that you're working in would not be able to get the government grants for you as one of their qualified teachers, and that really affects the salary you would be eligible for. And in the end, when you realize that you're not too happy with the outcome, and probably most of the clients at that time regret wasting a lot of time in this process, probably conveying that if they had an advisor assisting or somebody guiding them through the process, probably they would not have wasted all that time and effort going through the discretionary path. Would have rather been benefited more if they would have instead got a qualification in New Zealand and considered to be and that qualification leading to registration. As a result, they would have then become a qualified and a trained teacher in New Zealand. So what happens is every school gets government grant, and the amount of grant that they would be eligible for would really depend on the number of qualified teachers and trained teachers that they have in their school and the teacher-student ratio. So if you got the registration through the discretionary path, you would be a registered teacher, however not a qualified teacher, and hence it would affect the amount of grant the school gets, it would affect the amount of salary that you are being paid, and that is what you need to consider when you're going through that path. Another question that I get, and I would really like to answer it here, would be, how do I select my sector that I need to I would like to teach in? So I would say to all the overseas trained teachers, really depends on your strength, what is more comfortable for you. So New Zealand, you can select your sector. You can select early childhood sector, wherein you would teach children in the age group of 0 to 5. You could select the primary sector, wherein you would be teaching the students in the school years of 0 to 8, and above that would be the secondary sector. So really depends on what your strengths are, what makes you more comfortable, where would you like to be engaged in. Select your sector carefully, because your registration has to be in alignment with the sector that you need to teach in, firstly. Secondly, for all those teachers who have not got a overseas qualification in alignment or comparable to a New Zealand teaching qualification, they may be required to come and enroll and study a course in New Zealand, and then they need to select the course in accordance with the sector they would like to teach in. So if you would like to teach in early childhood sector, probably you'll have to do a graduate diploma in teaching, or a postgraduate diploma in teaching, or a master's in teaching in early childhood. If you would like to teach in primary sectors, then you would probably have to do a graduate diploma in teaching primary or a master's in teaching primary, and which will lead to a registration for teachers in that sector, and then you can teach in early childhood or primary or secondary, depending upon what your interest is. So another question that I do get is, I've got my registration sorted, what else should I be aware of? So if you got your registration and you have a practicing certificate to teach in New Zealand, you need to have a job before you can apply for a visa to come and teach in New Zealand. You need to have a valid visa to be in New Zealand and to teach in New Zealand, and that's where we can come in handy. So what visa would you be eligible for, whether it is better for you to apply for a work visa from overseas, whether it is better to apply for a residence from overseas and come straight on a residence. So it really depends on your time frames, depends on how early the employer wants you to start the employment, and other factors. So as an advisor, we could assist you with your visa applications. We could probably vet your employment contracts to see whether they are meeting the requirement for Immigration New Zealand. Probably we can give you the alternate options, liaise with your employer to see that we support them with whatever documents the immigration needs for them to be able for you to get a visa to come and work here in New Zealand. And apart from that, for all those who've got families, for all those who are considering coming to New Zealand with their families, we could really help in all the visa applications. So if you're coming to work in New Zealand, your partners would be eligible for a partnership based work visa. Children would be eligible for visitor or a student visa depending upon the age. So if you have a child less than 5 years would be eligible for a dependent child visitor visa. If you have a child more than 5 years, would be eligible for a dependent child student visa, wherein they can study in New Zealand as a domestic fee paying student, and that will be without a cost for you as well. So that's all we can help you with your immigration matters. There's another thing that I really would like you to be aware of, and that is, even though there is this option of getting overseas qualification assist, however, I am aware that not all countries have the qualifications which are comparable to New Zealand teaching qualification, and then as an advisor we do have a fair idea of which those countries or universities would be, what is really needed to be seen as far as the practicum component of your overseas qualification is. So if you have a qualification which historically hasn't been considered to be comparable to New Zealand teaching qualification, then you would rather, it's better for you to come and get trained in New Zealand rather than doing all those efforts and realizing that too late, and in the end wasting few precious months as well. If your qualification is not comparable to a New Zealand teaching qualification, then what? So then the best way for you, if you're considering teaching in New Zealand, is come and do a qualification in New Zealand. Select your sector carefully. Where do you want to teach? And come and do a qualification in New Zealand which gives you registration to teach in that sector. It could be early childhood, it could be primary, it could be secondary, and the added benefits that you could have as a result would be your family can move with you. If you are doing one of those qualifications, suppose you're doing a master's qualification in teaching, your partner can come here with you while you are studying, be on a work visa, an open work visa while you study. Your children can be in New Zealand with you while you are studying a teaching qualification, and your children can be eligible for a domestic fee paying student visa. That means their education would not cost you much, and apart from that, as soon as you finish your qualification, you would be eligible for a 3-year or a 1-year or 3-year post-study work visa, depending upon what you study and where you study. You would be eligible for 1 to 3 years of post-study work rights, and during this time you will have an open work visa. You will have enough time to apply to Teaching Council of New Zealand, get yourself registered, get a practicing certification with you, and get a job, a teacher's job in New Zealand. As soon as you get that, you would have enough points to be eligible to apply for a New Zealand residence visa as well under the skilled migrant category. So if in your long-term plans, coming, teaching in New Zealand, getting a work visa, probably considering getting a residence and working long-term, that's what is one of your plans, and then definitely teaching qualification will not disappoint you. Teaching qualification, just because there is so much of a shortage for teachers, has got excellent graduate outcomes. Anybody who gets a qualification which leads to registration, the jobs would not be a problem because teachers are in extreme shortage here in New Zealand. So when you get a job as a teacher, you have enough points to apply for your residence. You can easily move on from work to residence visa as well. Another benefit of doing a teacher's qualification in New Zealand is that when you apply for residence for one of those jobs where registration is mandatory, your residence application is fast tracked. It's prioritized. So if you're following New Zealand immigration, you would have heard a lot about the delays in SMC applications, the delays or the time processing residence application is taking in New Zealand. So out there, all you teachers, when you apply for a residence visa for one of those roles where registration is a mandatory requirement for you to to work in New Zealand, your application is prioritized, and that's another benefit. So I do understand that most of you would be settled quite comfortably in your country or wherever you are working. You really would not like to put everything at stake and come to a country if that doesn't offer you a smooth pathway. So I can let you know from my experience that most of the overseas qualified teachers who've come here with a teacher's registration, who've got a job as a teacher, they have a really smooth pathway to residence as well, because most of the teachers are paid above the salary threshold that is needed for residents to apply for a residence visa, and B, because being registration being a mandatory requirement, the applications are prioritized and it leads to residence faster. So before I end, I would like to spread this word around to all those skilled teachers teaching in Middle East, India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, UK. Please do consider New Zealand as one of your options if you're considering relocating at any stage. You could have a pathway straight coming here as a registered teacher. Your pathway could involve getting a short-term training in New Zealand before you move on and get your registration. Whichever way it may be, it's still worth the efforts. Put in your questions if you have any. I'll make an endeavor to either answer those or make another video covering and answering all those questions that you do have in this space. Thank you so much. Thanks.